I was standing in the back of a chandelier-lit ballroom at the Magnolia Grand in Charleston when my ex-husband slipped a diamond ring onto my best friend's finger. And everyone applauded like this was a love story instead of a public execution. Crystal glasses clinked. A string quartet played something soft and expensive. White roses framed the altar in perfect symmetry. And there I was, invisible in a navy dress I'd worn to what I thought would be the last formal event of my old life. Marissa turned just slightly, just enough to make sure I could see her smile. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't apologetic. It was calculated, like she had rehearsed it in the mirror. Daniel didn't look at me at all. He didn't have to. The room already knew who had won. 6 weeks earlier, I had signed a prenup he swore was just a business formality. 6 weeks. That was all it took for my marriage, my friendship, and my place in the company we built to be erased. She leaned into him as if everything had gone exactly according to plan. Because in her mind, it had. They believed my signature had locked away every right I had. They believed I had signed myself out of the family business, out of the assets, out of the future. What they didn't know, what neither of them had bothered to read carefully, was that something inside that agreement had not been triggered yet. And when it would change everything. I kept my hands folded in front of me while Daniel repeated vows about loyalty and partnership. Words we had once said to each other in a smaller chapel outside Atlanta, before Hayes Freight Systems ever became a serious company, before investors, before legal teams, before manipulation disguised as financial planning. His parents sat in the front row. His father clapped first when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. His mother dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. No one looked back at me. It was as if I had been written out of the narrative entirely. The reception moved quickly. Champagne towers, camera flashes, corporate partners in tailored suits congratulating Daniel on new beginnings. One board member even said, "Clean transitions are always best for a growing company." Clean? I stepped toward the terrace doors, needing air. My phone buzzed in my clutch. For a moment, I almost ignored it. Then I glanced down. The subject line read, "Irregular Disclosure Addendum." It was from Michael Stern's office, my attorney. I didn't open it yet. I wasn't ready to let the night split open. Instead, I slipped the phone back inside my bag and watched Marissa glide across the marble floor like she had always belonged there. 6 months earlier, none of this had seemed inevitable. We were in Daniel's home office in Buckhead, spreadsheets glowing on his screen. When he first brought up the prenup, Hayes Freight was expanding into new interstate contracts. Investors wanted clarity, he said. Clean liability separation, separate property classifications, asset protection language that would reassure everyone. It's just structure. He told me. Strong marriages survive paperwork. I remember sitting across from him, watching the reflection of numbers in his glasses. I wanted to be the supportive wife, the rational partner, the woman who understood business growth required uncomfortable decisions. Marissa started coming over more often around that time. She said she was helping plan a charity gala connected to the company's expansion. She reinforced Daniel's logic gently. Modern couples protected assets. Transparency protected everyone. If everything was solid, paperwork shouldn't scare me. The signing happened in a glass conference room in Buckhead. The documents were thick, clinical, filled with terms like disclosure obligations and fiduciary acknowledgments. I skimmed sections more than I should have. I trusted the lawyer. I trusted my husband. There was one clause about complete and truthful financial disclosure prior to execution. The language was dense, layered. I asked if everything had been fully updated. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. "Of course," he said easily. I signed. 3 weeks later, I was served divorce papers at Hayes Freight headquarters. A courier handed me the envelope at reception like it was a routine delivery. Irreconcilable differences. That was the phrase. I stood in the lobby staring at the company logo mounted behind the front desk, the company we built together, and felt something shift. Not grief. Not yet. Something colder. The timing made no sense. The divorce filing date overlapped suspiciously with the finalization of the prenup. When I asked Daniel, he said it was coincidence. A realization that came late. Then the wedding invitation arrived. Thick ivory cardstock. Formal. Deliberate. Bride. Marissa Cole. Groom. Daniel Hayes. The ceremony date barely 2 months after our separation filing. Back in the Charleston ballroom. Applause erupted again as they kissed. I finally stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the harbor. Fireworks cracked faintly in the distance. Probably from another celebration somewhere else along the water. My phone buzzed again. This time, I opened the email. Michael's message was brief. There appeared to be an inconsistency in the financial disclosure schedule attached to my prenup. Certain asset transfers may have occurred prior to final certification. If disclosure had not been complete at the time of execution, some protections Daniel believed were secure might not apply. I read the sentence twice. Inside, laughter echoed across polished marble floors. For weeks, I had felt replaced, excluded, erased from my own life story. But standing there under the Charleston night sky, staring at legal language most people would ignore, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not revenge. Awareness. They thought the story had ended with my signature. They had no idea it was the beginning of mine. 6 months before that wedding, Daniel stood in his home office with the Atlanta skyline glowing behind him and told me a prenup was the smartest move we could make for the company. Hayes Freight Systems had just secured preliminary interest from 2 out-of-state investors. Interstate contracts. Bigger routes. Higher visibility. He said expansion came with risk, and risk required structure. Separate property classifications. Asset shielding. Clean lines between marriage and business. It protects both of us, he insisted, scrolling through spreadsheets. This isn't about divorce. It's about growth. I wanted to believe that I had spent years helping him build the company from a 2-truck operation into a regional logistics network. Late nights. Vendor calls. Budget cuts. I wasn't just his wife. I was part of the foundation. But something about the urgency unsettled me. He kept mentioning deadlines. The end of the quarter. Investor confidence. Regulatory optics. Strong marriages survive paperwork, he said again, as if repetition would make it unquestionably true. Marissa started showing up more often around that time. She said she was helping coordinate a charity gala tied to the company's expansion announcement. She brought wine, spreadsheets, enthusiasm. She echoed Daniel's logic with a softer tone. It's modern, she told me one evening in my kitchen. You're protecting your assets. That's not betrayal. That's maturity. If everything was solid, paperwork shouldn't scare me. I wasn't scared. I was uneasy, and I couldn't articulate why. A week later, Daniel introduced something new, a temporary power of attorney. He said it would allow him to sign certain operational financial documents while traveling between states for contract negotiations. It's limited, he assured me. Purely administrative. The document looked routine, technical, but I noticed the effective date was immediate, before the prenup was finalized. Why now? I asked. Because expansion is happening now. His answer was smooth. Practiced. I signed that one too. The prenup signing took place in a glass conference room in Buckhead. Neutral décor. Polished table. Our attorney sat across from us with a stack of documents that felt heavier than they should have. There were clauses about separate property, about disclosure obligations, about certification of full financial transparency prior to execution. I paused at that section. Have all asset schedules been fully updated? I asked. Daniel answered before the attorney could. Yes. The lawyer nodded and flipped the page. I noticed he did not physically review an attachment at that moment. He trusted Daniel's affirmation. Under the table, Daniel's hand found mine. A quiet squeeze. Reassuring. Or maybe steadying. I signed my name on every indicated line. In the hallway afterward, Daniel stepped away to take a phone call. His voice dropped lower. Calm. But different. "It's done," I heard him say. I told myself he meant the paperwork. 3 weeks later, I was served divorce papers at the Hayes Freight headquarters. A courier asked for my name at reception and handed me the envelope as if it were any other delivery. Irreconcilable differences. I walked into my old office and shut the door before opening it. The date on the petition caught my eye. Drafted before the final execution date of the prenup. That detail settled in my chest like a stone. When I confronted Daniel, he claimed the realization had come gradually. The paperwork timing was coincidence. Attorneys moved fast. But coincidence didn't explain the sequence. It didn't explain the power of attorney effective date. It didn't explain the urgency. Friends began treating me differently almost overnight. Invitations thinned. Conversations shortened. Someone started repeating the narrative that I had wanted space, that I had agreed to restructure our lives. I never said that. I later obtained a copy of the court filing metadata through my attorney. The divorce petition had been drafted days before the prenup was signed. That meant one thing. The decision had already been made when I sat in that conference room believing I was protecting our future. I requested certified copies of every document I had signed. Every attachment. Every disclosure schedule. If this had been planned, there would be a paper trail. That night, sitting alone at my dining table, I compared dates across the prenup, the power of attorney, and the divorce filing. The timeline didn't align cleanly. It overlapped, intersected, shifted in ways that suggested coordination. I called Michael, my attorney, and asked him directly whether timing discrepancies could matter. "They can," he said carefully, "especially if asset disclosures were incomplete at the time of execution." Incomplete. I replayed the signing day in my mind. The clause about complete and truthful disclosure. Daniel's quick answer. The attorney's nod. What if assets were moved before disclosure was finalized? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Then the protections he believes he secured. Michael said slowly, may not be as absolute as he thinks. For the first time since I was handed those divorce papers, I felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak. Alertness. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a thick ivory envelope that felt heavier than it should have. My name was printed formally. MS. Lauren Whitmore. No acknowledgement of history. No trace of what had existed before. Bride. Marissa Cole. Groom. Daniel Hayes. The ceremony was scheduled less than 2 months after the divorce filing. I sat at my kitchen counter staring at the date, doing the math over and over again like it might rearrange itself into something less humiliating. It didn't. This wasn't romance. It was choreography. My mother told me not to go. Dignity doesn't require an audience, she said gently. My attorney was more neutral. If there are questions about timing or optics, he said, observation can be useful. That word stayed with me. Observation. So I went, not as a guest, as a witness. The Magnolia Grand Ballroom in Charleston was designed for spectacle. Crystal chandeliers, white roses lining the aisle, a string quartet positioned perfectly beneath a vaulted ceiling painted in soft gold tones. It was extravagant without appearing desperate, strategic without looking cold. Corporate partners filled the front rows. Several board members from Hayes Freight Systems sat beside Daniel's parents. When his father stood to greet guests, he looked proud, relieved, almost. As Marissa walked down the aisle, she looked radiant, confident, certain. Daniel's expression was calm, composed, like a man stepping into something inevitable rather than risky. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause erupted quickly. Too quickly. During the reception, champagne glasses clinked beneath chandeliers while conversations blended into a polished hum. I overheard one investor congratulate Daniel on streamlining ownership complications. Ownership complications. I stepped onto the terrace for air. But the night offered no comfort. Harbor lights flickered across the water, distant and detached. Inside, Daniel's father raised a glass for a toast. Welcome to the family, he told Marissa. And to the business, That phrase landed heavier than the vows. This marriage wasn't just emotional. It was structural. Marissa found me near the bar later that evening. She approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm glad you came," she said lightly. "It shows maturity." I studied her face. No apology. No guilt. Just assurance. "Everything worked out the way it was supposed to," she added. The way it was supposed to. I didn't argue. I simply nodded and watched her return to Daniel's side like a piece sliding back into position. Outside again, I found myself near two senior managers from Hayes Freight. They were speaking quietly. Unaware, I stood just beyond the terrace doors. One of them mentioned a recent asset transfer into a newly formed trust. The trust's name included Marissa's maiden initials. My pulse sharpened. "When was that created?" the other asked. "Right around the time the restructuring paperwork was finalized," came the reply. "Actually, I think a few days before." Before? They continued discussing equity percentages, voting shares, internal compliance checks. One of them muttered, "If the disclosure schedule wasn't updated, that could be a problem." I stepped back before they noticed me. Later, a familiar voice said my name softly. I turned to see Victor Ramirez, the former company accountant who had left abruptly 2 months earlier. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure either." He hesitated, then handed me a folded sheet of paper. "You should look at this." It was a summary of internal ledger adjustments, equity movement entries dated days before the prenup execution. The percentages shifted subtly but significantly, enough to alter apparent ownership distribution before the divorce filing. "Why show me this?" I asked. He glanced toward the ballroom doors. "Because if those transfers weren't fully disclosed before certification, that's not just marital strategy. That's risk. Risk." Back inside, Daniel gave a speech thanking Marissa for standing beside him during difficult transitions. There was an implication in his tone, a suggestion that I had been unstable, complicated, obstructive. Some guests glanced at me with sympathy. Others avoided me entirely. They were rewriting history in real time. I left before the cake cutting. The air outside was cool and smelled faintly of salt and smoke from distant fireworks. In my car, under a streetlight, I unfolded Victor's document again and compared the dates to the prenup execution timeline I had memorized. The alignment was too precise to be accidental. Asset transfers into a trust tied to Marissa, occurring before full disclosure certification. The narrative shifted in my mind. This wasn't betrayal born from emotion. It was restructuring designed for exclusion. I called Michael from the parking lot. "There may have been equity movement before disclosure was finalized," I said quietly. He didn't respond immediately. "If that's accurate," he said at last, "it changes the analysis significantly." Fireworks cracked faintly above the harbor behind me. They had staged a wedding that looked like victory. But as I drove away from that ballroom, I realized something steady and undeniable. If the timeline was manipulated, then so was the protection they thought they secured. The morning after the wedding, I spread every document across my dining table like evidence in a case that had finally begun to make sense. Victor's folded ledger summary sat beside my laptop. My prenup lay open to the disclosure clause. The power of attorney document was clipped to the side, its effective date circled in pen. I built a timeline. Trust formation date. Power of attorney activation. Prenup execution. Divorce filing. The trust had been created 3 days before the prenup was signed. Not after. Before. I stared at that detail longer than anything else. If equity had been moved before disclosure was certified, then the foundation of the agreement shifted. I scheduled an emergency meeting with Michael. His office in Buckhead overlooked the Atlanta skyline, all steel and glass and quiet ambition. He reviewed the documents without rushing, flipping pages slowly, occasionally making notes in the margins. "The disclosure clause is clear," he said finally. "Asset protection provisions are contingent upon full and accurate disclosure prior to execution." "Contingent," I repeated. "Yes." If material information was omitted or altered before certification, enforceability can be challenged. I told him about the trust, about Marissa's initials embedded in its name, about the ledger adjustments Victor had shown me. Michael requested public filings immediately. Within hours, we had access to the trust registration documents. The trustee was an outside financial advisor closely tied to Daniel. The trust controlled a percentage of voting shares in Hayes Freight Systems. The transfer had reduced my apparent stake before the divorce settlement discussions even began. This wasn't emotional, I said quietly. It was strategic. Michael nodded once. It appears so. As we dug deeper, another detail surfaced. The shareholder agreement for Hayes Freight required spousal acknowledgement for certain equity reallocations involving marital interest. I don't remember signing anything beyond the prenup, I said. He searched the file. There was no separate acknowledgement bearing my signature. A tight calm settled over me. We revisited the power of attorney next. Its effective date predated the trust filing. It granted Daniel authority to execute certain financial certifications on behalf of joint disclosures during interstate negotiations. Could he have certified disclosures under that authority? I asked. He could have signed documentation, Michael said carefully. But that does not eliminate the obligation of truthful disclosure. The prenup referenced attached financial schedules incorporated by certification. Those same schedules mirrored figures used in corporate filings tied to expansion contracts. If disclosure was incomplete in one document, it could contaminate multiple filings. That realization shifted the scale entirely. This was no longer only about a divorce settlement or a personal betrayal. It intersected with corporate governance, with fiduciary duty, with investor reliance. Triggering this formally would require notification to the board, Michael said. Possibly to compliance officers. Would it freeze anything? I asked. It could delay distributions tied to disputed equity. It would not be quiet. Silence would be easier. But silence would validate deception. I authorized him to draft a formal notice requesting complete financial disclosure audit and review of equity transfers prior to prenup execution. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. A trigger. Within hours of delivery, my phone lit up. Daniel's name appeared across the screen. His voice was calm, but thinner than usual. Lauren, you don't want to do this. Do what? I asked evenly. Escalate a misunderstanding. Was the trust created before the prenup was executed? I asked. A pause. Too long. It was part of restructuring, he said. Was it disclosed in the final schedule attached to the prenup? Another pause. You're taking advice from people who don't understand the full picture. I understand dates, I replied. His tone shifted slightly. If this becomes public, it affects more than just us. There it was again. Not fear of divorce. Fear of exposure. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't quicken. I had spent weeks feeling humiliated, replaced, excluded from the company I helped build. Now I saw the architecture behind it. The trust, the power of attorney, the prenup certification. If equity had been moved before disclosure was finalized, then the very document they believed protected them might contain the fracture that exposed them. Later that afternoon, Michael called again. There's something else, he said. The certification attached to the trust references complete spousal knowledge. I never saw it, I said. That's the point. I looked back down at the prenup. At the dense paragraph about full and truthful disclosure prior to execution. Daniel had once told me paperwork was just formality. But paperwork carries timelines, signatures, certifications, obligations, and sometimes those details outlive the people who try to manipulate them. Daniel called me the morning after the formal disclosure request was delivered to the board. You're making a mistake, he said without greeting. His voice was controlled, but the calm sounded practiced. This kind of escalation damages investor confidence. I asked for documentation, I replied. That shouldn't damage anything if everything was clean. It feels like revenge, he said. The word hung between us. This isn't about revenge, I said evenly. It's about disclosure. He exhaled sharply. The board has been informed of potential disruption. I hadn't contacted the board directly. That meant he had. 2 days later, I received formal notice of an emergency board meeting at Hayes Freight headquarters in Atlanta. The subject line read, Ownership Clarification Review. I walked into the conference room with Michael at my side. The polished table reflected the ceiling lights in a way that made the room feel colder than usual. Daniel sat at the head, composed. Marissa sat to his right, not as a guest, but as beneficiary of the trust under discussion. Several independent directors avoided my eyes. Others looked openly curious. Daniel began by summarizing the restructuring. All equity transfers were lawful and properly documented, he said. There was full compliance with our disclosure obligations. Michael waited until he finished. Then he placed copies of the timeline on the table. The trust formation predates the prenup execution, he said calmly. We are requesting confirmation that all beneficial interests were fully disclosed prior to certification. A director near the window frowned. Are you suggesting material non-disclosure? We are requesting verification, Michael replied. I watched Daniel's expression remain steady, but his jaw tightened slightly. The shareholder agreement was projected on the screen. Section 9 required spousal acknowledgement for certain equity reallocations affecting marital interest. I do not recall signing a separate acknowledgement beyond the prenup, I said clearly. Marissa shifted in her seat. The restructuring was transparent, she said. We relied on counsel. Transparency is not a feeling, I said quietly. It's documentation. The room fell silent. One of the independent directors requested internal audit documentation. Another asked whether outside compliance counsel had reviewed the timing of transfers. Daniel attempted to reframe the discussion. This is a personal dispute spilling into corporate governance. It became corporate, I replied, when voting shares moved before full disclosure. A recess was called. In the hallway, Marissa approached me quickly, her heels striking the marble floor with sharp precision. What exactly are you trying to trigger? She asked under her breath. I studied her face. For the first time, there was no smile. I'm not triggering anything, I said. I'm asking questions. You're risking everything, she snapped softly. Investors, employees, reputation. Was the trust created before the final disclosure schedule was certified? I asked. She hesitated. Just for a second. It was part of strategic planning, she said finally. That's not what I asked. She looked away first. When we returned to the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Less confident, more cautious. Michael outlined the potential consequences of material misrepresentation. If disclosure discrepancies were confirmed, certain asset protections tied to corporate valuation could be challenged. An internal compliance review would be necessary. That could freeze dividend distributions. One director said, It could, Michael replied. But failing to review could expose the board to liability. The word liability changed the tone entirely. The directors began speaking more carefully, weighing reputational risk against loyalty. Hayes Freight was expanding across state lines. Interstate contracts meant regulatory oversight. Transparency was no longer optional. A vote was called to initiate an internal compliance review pending external forensic accounting. The motion passed. Daniel's face didn't change. But something in his posture did. A fraction less certainty. After the meeting, he followed me into the parking garage. The air smelled faintly of oil and concrete. You're endangering everyone's livelihood, he said, the composure finally thinning. If this spirals, people lose jobs. If disclosure was complete. There's nothing to spiral, I replied. You're pushing this because you're angry. I'm pushing this because dates don't lie. He stepped closer. If this goes federal, it won't just be about divorce. That word again. Federal? I held his gaze. Then maybe you should have thought about that before certifying disclosures. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above us. "You don't understand what you're starting," he said. "No," I answered calmly. "You don't understand what you already started." As I drove away, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The company's external compliance officer had requested a private meeting. The subject line read, "Disclosure Certification Timeline." They had called this a personal matter, a family drama. But sitting in that parking garage, I understood something clearly. The board was no longer certain they had been fully informed. And doubt, once introduced into a room full of directors, doesn't disappear quietly. I met Rebecca Lang in a neutral office downtown, far from Hayes Freight headquarters and even farther from anything that looked personal. She was the company's external compliance officer, precise and measured, the kind of woman who spoke only after reviewing every word in her mind. "The issue isn't just internal governance," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Some of the disclosure schedules attached to your prenup were mirrored in interstate regulatory filings tied to expansion contracts." I opened the folder slowly. Dates, certifications, signatures. If those asset schedules were incomplete at the time they were certified, she continued, then the inaccuracy doesn't stay within marital law. It crosses into reporting obligations. Reporting obligations. Federal exposure. The words felt heavy, but not surprising. Daniel had warned me without meaning to. If this goes federal, I left the meeting with a copy of the certification timeline and drove straight to Michael's office. We spread everything out again. Prenup clause. Trust formation documents. Corporate filings. The prenup language was clear. Asset protection provisions were contingent upon full and truthful disclosure prior to execution. The financial schedules were incorporated by certification. If disclosure was incomplete in the prenup, I said, and those same schedules were used in regulatory filings. Michael finished the thought. Then inaccuracies could multiply. He leaned back in his chair. Triggering this formally will require notification beyond the board. Insurers. Possibly regulators? The quiet phase was ending. Daniel called that evening and asked to meet in person. We chose a restaurant in Midtown that valued privacy. Dim lighting. Polished wood. Controlled conversations. He didn't waste time. There were clerical inconsistencies, he said. Nothing intentional. You're blowing this out of proportion. Was the trust created before the final disclosure schedule was certified? I asked again. He exhaled slowly. The restructuring timeline was fluid. That's not what I asked. He shifted strategies. We can settle this. Privately. Generously. A financial offer disguised as reconciliation. If I withdraw the audit request, I said. What happens to the regulatory filings? He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me more than any explanation would have. If regulators get involved, investors panic, he said finally. The company suffers. I realized then that his fear was no longer about divorce. It was about documentation. 2 days later, Marissa showed up at my townhouse unannounced. Her composure was cracked around the edges. She didn't step fully inside. She stood near the doorway like she was prepared to retreat. "You're escalating something that doesn't need to be escalated," she said. "I relied on Daniel's advisors. I signed trustee acknowledgement forms because I trusted the process." "Did you read every attachment?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. "That's not how these things work." "That's exactly how they work." She pressed her lips together. "You're risking employees' jobs. Families? Disclosure protects families," I replied. "Concealment doesn't." She looked at me differently then. Not superior. Not triumphant. Afraid. That night, alone at my dining table again, I reviewed the notarized certification attached to the trust. It referenced complete spousal knowledge. My signature was nowhere on the document. Silence would have been easier. But silence would mean agreeing that manipulation should go unexamined. Michael drafted the formal notice alleging material misrepresentation tied to disclosure schedules. Once submitted, the board would be obligated to escalate internally and notify insurers. I read the document twice before signing authorization. My hand did not shake. Within hours of delivery, Hayes Freight paused dividend distributions tied to the disputed equity pending review. The announcement was internal, but the tension spread quickly through executive ranks. Daniel's executive authority was restricted during the compliance investigation. An oversight committee was appointed. Investors requested briefings. Industry whispers began. No headlines yet? But enough quiet questions to unsettle even the most confident room. Michael called me late that evening. The matter has been referred to Regulatory Counsel for evaluation, he said. If disclosure was knowingly inaccurate, personal liability could extend beyond corporate penalties. Personal liability. I ended the call and stood at my window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. The same skyline Daniel had once stood in front of when he told me paperwork was just structure. He had believed the prenup would shield him. He had believed asset transfers would simplify ownership. He had believed I would walk away quietly, embarrassed, excluded, defeated. Instead, the very documents designed to protect him were now under scrutiny. This was no longer a family drama contained within private conversations. It was a compliance review intersecting with regulatory obligations. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. He once told me not to escalate. But the truth doesn't escalate. It surfaces. 2 weeks after the compliance review began, the board convened again, this time with outside counsel seated at the far end of the table and forensic accounting reports stacked in front of every director. The atmosphere was different. Not tense in a dramatic way. Tense in a legal way. Measured. Careful. The lead forensic accountant spoke first. He outlined the timeline with clinical precision. Asset transfers into the Marissa-linked trust occurred 3 days before the prenup execution date. The disclosure schedule attached to the prenup did not reflect those transfers at the time of certification. There it was. Documented. Recorded. No emotion attached. Outside counsel took over. We have reviewed internal email correspondence as well, she said. There is evidence suggesting premeditated restructuring prior to final disclosure certification. A printed email was projected onto the screen. From Daniel to his financial advisor. Time-stamped days before I signed the prenup. We need to shield marital exposure before final execution. Make sure voting shares are secured. No one spoke for several seconds. Daniel cleared his throat. That language was taken out of context, he said. We were preparing for expansion. This was asset planning. Asset planning requires disclosure. Outside counsel replied calmly. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. One of the independent directors leaned forward. Were these equity movements disclosed in the final certified schedule attached to the prenup? Daniel hesitated. They were reflected in internal projections, he said. That's not the question, the director replied. The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. The trust documentation was examined next. The trustee acknowledgement referenced complete disclosure compliance. Because the disclosure appeared incomplete at the time of certification, the trust's protective positioning was now under scrutiny. Dividend distributions tied to that trust had already been suspended. Marissa sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly together. She did not meet my eyes. The confidence she wore in that Charleston ballroom was gone. Outside counsel outlined the risk exposure. If material non-disclosure was established, asset shield provisions tied to corporate valuation in the prenup could be deemed unenforceable. Regulatory review would continue. This is no longer a marital disagreement, she said. This is a governance issue. A closed session was called. Daniel was asked to step out temporarily. I remained. When the directors returned, their decision was delivered without spectacle, pending full investigation. Daniel would step back from executive leadership responsibilities. An interim oversight structure would be implemented immediately. Daniel re-entered the room just in time to hear the formal wording. He nodded once, too stiffly. Understood. After the meeting, he followed me into the hallway. His composure had fractured. You're tearing down everything we built, he said quietly. I didn't move the dates, I replied. You could have handled this privately. You handled it privately, I said. That's the problem. His jaw tightened. You're enjoying this. I looked at him steadily. No, I'm correcting it. He had no response to that. Later that afternoon, Michael called with additional updates. Regulatory Counsel had formally acknowledged that disclosure irregularities materially impacted enforceability of the asset protection provisions within the prenup. That means, he said carefully, those protections are suspended pending final determination. Suspended. The document they believed erased me no longer functioned as a shield. Within days, the court acknowledged potential material non-disclosure. Marital property classification reopened for review. My equity stake in Hayes Freight was reinstated provisionally while investigations continued. The shift was structural, legal, undeniable. Industry whispers grew louder. Investors demanded transparency statements. Hayes Freight removed the wedding announcement photos from its corporate homepage. Marissa deleted several social media posts referencing new beginnings and fresh starts. The narrative was no longer about a smooth transition. It was about disclosure, accountability, and fiduciary duty. Daniel called once more, his voice subdued. This didn't have to happen, he said. It already did. I answered. They thought my signature locked me out. Instead, it became the timestamp that exposed them. The courtroom in Fulton County felt smaller than I expected. Almost ordinary. Like the end of something that had once seemed enormous. There were no chandeliers, no champagne towers, no applause, just polished wood, quiet voices, and the steady rhythm of legal procedure. The judge reviewed the forensic audit findings and the compliance summaries without theatrics. Dates were referenced. Certifications were read aloud. The phrase material non-disclosure was repeated more than once. Daniel sat 2 rows ahead of me. Shoulders straight, expression neutral. Marissa sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. When the judge finally spoke about the prenup, the room seemed to inhale at once. Given the evidence of incomplete financial disclosure prior to execution, he said, the asset protection provisions contingent upon full certification are unenforceable pending final resolution. Unenforceable. The word didn't echo dramatically. It simply landed. My equity stake in Hayes Freight Systems was formally reinstated pending settlement. Marital property classification reopened under corrected disclosure standards. The document they believed had excluded me no longer functioned as a barrier. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just breathed. In the weeks that followed, the corporate consequences unfolded quietly but firmly. The board announced Daniel's resignation as chief executive officer pending the outcome of regulatory review. An interim leadership structure was implemented. Public compliance reforms were outlined in a carefully worded statement about transparency and accountability. Dividend distributions tied to the disputed trust remained frozen. The trust itself was under validation review. Its protective assumptions no longer secure. Investors responded not with panic, but with cautious support for corrective action. Transparency, it turned out, carried its own kind of stability. Daniel requested one final meeting. We met in a glass-walled office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The same skyline he had once stood before while explaining why a prenup was just structure. This wasn't supposed to go this far, he said quietly. Then you shouldn't have pushed it that far, I replied. He rubbed his forehead, suddenly looking less like a strategist and more like a man confronting the limits of control. I was protecting the company. By hiding ownership movement, I asked. He didn't answer. You underestimated me, he said instead. No, I corrected gently. You underestimated documentation. That was the last time we spoke privately. I ran into Marissa once more in a courthouse hallway weeks later. No photographers. No audience. She looked different without the ballroom lighting and curated perfection. I never thought it would unravel like this, she said softly. It unraveled the moment it wasn't fully disclosed, I replied. She nodded faintly, as if she understood something now that confidence had once obscured. Our settlement negotiations concluded without spectacle. Undercorrected disclosure standards. Asset distribution reflected actual equity positions at the time of execution, not the altered structure Daniel had attempted to secure. I retained my reinstated share in Hayes Freight. I agreed to step into a temporary advisory oversight role during compliance restructuring, ensuring dual acknowledgement protocols were implemented for future equity transfers. I was not restored as a wife, but I was restored as a stakeholder. Months later, I stood alone in my townhouse kitchen, sunlight filtering across the same table where I had once spread out documents in disbelief. The humiliation of that Charleston wedding felt distant now, not erased, but transformed. I had learned something essential. Revenge isn't always loud. It isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's a calm insistence on truth. Sometimes it's refusing to disappear quietly when someone believes paperwork has erased you. They believed my signature locked me out. What they failed to understand is that every signature creates a trail. Every certification carries responsibility. Every clause matters. Women are often told to keep the peace, to trust, to avoid conflict for the sake of stability. But stability built on concealment is fragile. As I moved forward with my life, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. Clear about partnership, clear about financial transparency, clear about the difference between protection and control. The prenup they thought ended my story became the evidence that restored my position. If you've ever been told you're overreacting for asking questions, or accused of revenge when you simply demanded clarity, I want you to remember something. Documentation isn't cruelty. Transparency isn't sabotage. It's self-respect. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a situation where paperwork or financial decisions were used to manipulate or exclude you? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else recognize the red flags sooner. And if you want more stories about betrayal, justice, family drama, and the hidden power that comes from knowing your rights, stay here with me. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. And keep following along. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone else's life. It's refusing to let them rewrite yours.